Thanks everyone for joining our event, 5 Processes that will Reinvent P2P's View of Supplier Management. Let's go ahead and get things started. So I'm Jimmy Lefevre. I'm the Research Director here at PayStream Advisors. Joining me today is Constantine Liberakis and Gene Travers of Determine. Constantine and Gene, you want to introduce yourselves real quick?
Sure, Jimmy. Thanks again for having us. It's always a pleasure. My name is Constantine Liberakis, VP of Product Marketing here at Determine.
And Jimmy, thank you so much. My name is Gene Travers. I'm a Senior Solutions Engineer, also with Determine. I've got about 14 years background in purchasing and procurement at the C-suite level, strategic sourcing, supplier management, category management, contracting, and the like. And I have an interesting twist, however. Before joining Determine, I was actually a customer of the companies. So hopefully I can lend some insights as both a user of the platform and someone that has some background in purchasing and procurement.
Excellent. Very rare do we see that. So very interested to hear what you have to say. Thanks, guys, so much for being here. So for those of you that aren't familiar with PayStream Advisors, PayStream is a team of experts in all things back office processes and software. Whether we're talking about sourcing and supply chain to procurement, accounts payable, or payments and expense management. We use this expertise to help our subscribers and clients in a number of ways. The first way is through our free research reports and tools on our website, PayStreamAdvisors.com, which is where a lot of the data I'm going to discuss today actually comes from. These reports cover industry trends and adoption rates, as well as best practices, and profile leading solution providers for practitioners like yourself. Another way we help our clients is through thought leadership via speaking engagements like this webinar that we're doing right now. And even if you can't catch the live version, they're always available on demand on our website. The final way that we help our clients is through advisory services. We help organizations plan for automation with current state analysis and needs assessment, building an ROI case for automation, choosing the right solution, and even negotiating for the best deal. We'll also stick around for implementation and help things go smoothly there too. Like I said, our guest sponsor today is Determine. I wanted to see if the guys from Determine could tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Hey, Jimmy. Thank you for having us today. It's always a pleasure to be working with the likes of PayStream Advisors. We've always enjoyed working with them as an esteemed group. And just to tell you, as an audience here, a little bit about Determine. We've been an organization in the source-to-pay space for quite some time, and as many of you know, we came together last year and had a rebranding known as Determine from 3 separate companies who were experts in contract management, sourcing, and Procure-to-Pay. Today we are a leading global platform with over 300 clients around the world. We service companies in all walks of all different industries, and through our network of partners, we provide our technology, our leading cloud platform technology and source-to-pay. And being recognized by leading analysts, we really are focusing on the transformation of procurement today, which brings us to the discussion points that we would like to share with PayStream and some of the research that they've provided for us. So we really look forward to presenting this topic, and this is something that we think is something that's top of mind for many procurement professionals. And one of the ways that we are planning on doing this today during a discussion is talking and hinting at the advantages of the Procure-to-Pay approach that we take with the Determine Cloud platform. And some of the important things that you'll notice is that as part of the transition that we see in Procure-to-Pay is the advantages of having an easy and accessible solution that makes for rapid adoption, intuitive, unified experiences that improve for fast implementation and simplified integration. To this, we also improve with collaboration and make things more connected. Having online collaboration with partners makes things easy to integrate over the cloud. And of course, being local and global, today talking about Procure-to-Pay must go through being able to be accessible anywhere and anytime on any device, ensuring that there's a global access with local rules, whether you're dealing with the European market, the U.S. market, or dealing with Asia. And then finally, we're looking at the flexibility and innovation, so being able to adapt to customer requirements, design as solutions grow with your organization, and then being able to provide this total visibility and conformity to ensure that you're having compliance throughout the entire platform, an idea that becomes particularly important when we're talking about subjects like supplier management. And then finally, in dealing with the high level of security in the cloud and being able to provide performance and support that you're looking for within a procure-to-pay solution today. So thanks again for having us, and we look forward to talking to you about this idea of improving the P2P's view of supplier management. So I'm going to turn this back over to you, Jimmy.
All right. Thanks, Constantine. We look forward to hearing some more about the Determine solution a little bit later in the program. So here's a look at today's agenda. We're going to start with the latest and greatest research on P2P trends and efficiency. Then we're going to give you 5 everyday processes transformed through supplier management, and then we're going to end with some supplier management best practices. And then, of course, we're going to save time for your questions, and hopefully we'll have some answers for you at the end. We will save all Q&A towards the end, though, so be sure to type those in the chat box on your screen, and we'll get to those at the end of our session. So the next few slides come from our research reports. Like I said, all of which are free on our website for download. These statistics come from our survey outreach. Perhaps even some of you on the line today help us put these numbers together. They come from our surveying thousands of procurement and finance professionals every year. We actually asked hundreds of procurement professionals what their most common challenges were in procurement and how they thought they could, what could be the biggest improvement to their process. 30% of those respondents said that cost control and supplier negotiations can improve the most. Spend visibility and a more tight integration with the AP department were high on the list as well, along with contract compliance, data accuracy, and off-contract spend reduction. I wanted to ask you guys from Determine, when customers are coming to the Determine solution, what are the biggest pains that they're experiencing that they're looking to you guys and your solution to help solve or ease those pains?
Certainly, Jimmy. This is Gene. I'll go ahead and step in here. These are spot on. This is exactly what we're seeing in the marketplace. When we meet with prospective customers and current customers that are only using a portion of our solution, for example, these are some of the biggest pain points that they have. Spend visibility is absolutely huge. The cost control. We're actually going to dig into some of these a little bit later on as well.
Thanks, Gene. Looking forward to hearing more about that later. So for a minute, I'd like to touch on that third problem that we just saw, because the implications go into many different departments. It isn't just procurement and a lack of integration between procurement and AP. It can cause significant inefficiencies in supplier relationships, supply chain execution, employee morale, and many other areas. Nonetheless, most organizations report that there's some disconnect, whether that's being completely siloed, like the 31% here, or mostly separate with only shared leadership and maybe some shared goals. The point is that over 80% of organizations do not have completely integrated AP and procurement departments, and it's often the source of significant pains and frustrations. One of the ways that the lack of integration hurts both departments is that AP can really help drive the integration of suppliers into a P2P system. Most organizations report that less than 50% of their suppliers are actively integrated into their AP and procurement process, with almost a quarter saying that few and no suppliers are integrated into the procurement solution at all. And one of the more common problems with this is that purchase orders, the start and very foundation of the P2P process, ending up getting sent as paper, which puts an incredibly inefficient foundation at the start of the P2P process. And poor supplier data management is the leading problem for most organizations' strain on supplier relationships, along with late payments and poor supplier inquiry response times. This is actually what we asked from our subscriber base. What causes the most damage to your supplier relationships? The majority said problems arising from poor supplier data management, and then just as much a problem were late payments and slow supplier inquiries. These are all of these can be solved with a tighter integration between AP and procurement. And here's an example of how those failed relationships can really hurt your supply chain. 67% of organizations report they have difficulty ensuring contract compliance with suppliers, whether that's payment terms, quantity, quality, and price, or some other aspect of how, when, and what you're getting from them. And any of these can be detrimental to your operations and supply chain, which will ultimately affect your bottom line, right? So that brings us to our first poll question. So the first poll question is, as it relates to P2P and suppliers, what is the biggest risk your organization faces? Is it operational risk, things like impact on reputation? Is it financial risk, like an impact on the bottom line? Business continuity and impact on delivery? Technology and an impact of potential disruption? Or compliance and impact of non-conformance with regulations? I'll give you a couple seconds to answer that question. So managing supplier relationships starts with managing their information, managing their addresses, their payment remittance information, as well as managing information like tax, documents, and risk assessment. Supplier management solutions have come about in the past few years and greatly increased in popularity. Just last year, we asked our subscribers what percentage of them were using a supplier information management solution, and only about 8% said yes. Not just a year later, that number is already at 30%, which is astounding growth for a technology adoption. And what's more, 67% of those organizations report they have seen improved supplier relationships since implementing a supplier information management solution. Constantine and Gene, I know that Determine offers a solution in this area, and I want to know if you guys are seeing such high rates of customer satisfaction, especially improving supplier relationships amongst your customers.
I'm going to take this one, Gene. You know, actually, one of the things that you see is that supplier management really becomes, I think, that enhanced aspect to managing process. So if you look at, you know, any kind of process, whether you're dealing with it on the upstream or the downstream, we've seen that having the automation of the supplier management integrated with, you know, your core transactions, with your core processes, have tremendous impact on the ability to do collaboration. So yeah, absolutely. And often it's that intangible efficiency, you know, some of these things we're going to talk about, but, you know, it's also direct cost savings of, you know, knowing that, you know, you're not going to have to ask the supplier to come back and do things again and again and repeatedly, you know, create a chance to ruin the relationship because of lack of communication. So absolutely.
Excellent. All right, speaking of supplier management, Constantine, who is actually a former analyst, and Gene, a former practitioner, have come up with 5 processes to reinvent P2P's view of supplier management. I'm going to hand it over to them now, and they're going to discuss those 5 processes. Take it away, guys.
Thanks a lot again for that introduction, Jimmy. As part of this topic, you know, when we are coming up with an idea of talking about what we're seeing and working with our partner PayStream here, we really felt that this idea of supplier management and the ability to reinvent P2P is something that is just something that people are really thinking about today in a new way with a lot of the automation that's happening and what's happening with technology. So what we want to do is take a step back here and take a look at, you know, what are these 5 processes that will help you rethink this and what that means for supplier management. So the first one we thought of was the idea of supplier onboarding. So what I'm going to do on each one of these questions, I'm going to take a look at the question and then talk about that from the context of what we're experiencing from Gene's perspective as a solution engineer and as those that we are working very closely with our clients to understand. So from the supplier onboarding perspective, one of the things that we typically see here is that, you know, traditionally organizations have registered and onboarded their potential suppliers, but, you know, how easy is that and how expedient is that process as part of a P2P, you know, mechanism? So what have you seen there, Gene, and what are we experiencing in helping organizations there?
Certainly, Constantine. Actually, I'll go back and use myself as an example. When I first got into the industry, the company I was working with, we did it fairly typically, and we see this a lot. I still see this a lot, in that companies will have a web page off of their site that talks about supplier onboarding, supplier registration, becoming a potential supplier to their company, to that organization. And they may have a Microsoft Word document, basically a little form or Adobe PDF that's form fillable that a potential supplier could download, fill out, and then they're requested to send it back in, maybe email it back to a specific email address, maybe suppliers at, that company's domain name, for example, or even fax it back in. A lot of times suppliers question that, frankly, Constantine, because what happens to that when it's sent back in? And again, traditionally, what happens to it is that it goes into sort of old school technology. It goes into maybe an Excel spreadsheet or multiple spreadsheets, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. There may be spreadsheets across all of the business units, no unified single supplier repository, so to speak. Could go into Access databases. They could be printed, and they could just be placed in a filing cabinet somewhere.
So if we're seeing that, we're still seeing traditional means and things getting lost, even if it's in some kind of vendor system, it may not be connected. So from a best practices standpoint, what data should be captured during the onboarding, and how do you improve that?
Sure, good question. Well, ideally, you want to be able to capture multiple contacts. You're going to have an AP contact with a supplier. You are going to have your day-to-day contact, maybe an account rep. You may have a sales contact. So the point is, you may have multiple contacts with that supplier that's trying to onboard, and you need to have a system that can capture all of that different information, the names, the phone numbers, the email addresses, banking information, very important. And what's interesting is a lot of folks say, well, do you find that suppliers are willing to give that up? The real-world answer is certainly. I mean, that's how they get paid. They're more than willing to give you their banking information for automatic transfers, routing information, and so forth. So that's relatively easy to collect from those suppliers. Again, they want to get paid, so it's easy to get this from them. Again, you also want to properly classify the supplier, ideally using maybe an existing classification system like NAICS or UNSPSC. Even an ingrown, like a homegrown classification system, which I've seen a lot, is better than nothing. I worked with an educational institution one time that had their own very, very large, not as large as the two examples I just gave, but a very large homegrown classification system. That's fine. Again, it's better than having nothing and no way to classify the suppliers as to what they do. The other thing that's important is you want to be able to classify those suppliers so that you can extend proper opportunities to them. If you have a supplier that, I'll just use an electrician for example, an electrician does not want to receive fixtures, bids. Basically, they want things that are relevant to the business that they want from your organization. So again, a good classification system, again, allows you to really drive those bid opportunities that you have. You need to be able to assess and minimize your future risk. You need to collect bankruptcy information, current lawsuits that a potential supplier might be involved in, financial stability, proof there of a sufficient size to properly handle your company's business. Very, very important from a risk mitigation standpoint. And then you have the common things. You need to be able to collect a W-9, certificate of insurance, in addition to the certificate of insurance expiration date. Very, very important. There's nothing worse than having, for example, some contractors at your site, at one of your business unit sites, and their certificate of insurance expires while they're on your property and in the presence of your employees. So that's very, very important. Vertical specific information. If it's an IT-related supplier, you want to be able to ask them IT-related questions. Do you have an InfoSec questionnaire? Maybe you want to capture SOC 2 information, for example. And it's also useful if you have the ability to automatically route the supplier documentation to subsets of users in your organization for approval. For example, we just talked about IT. How powerful is it to have IT-related questionnaires as part of the onboarding process related to your IT staff so that they can review that and basically approve that that meets their standards and the supplier has provided everything that they need. Send your W-9s to accounting, for example, certificates of insurance to accounting as well for them to approve. So that's very powerful. Service area, what locations can a supplier service, and will those locations maybe have access to those suppliers once they're registered? Again, if your company is all North America, you may find the perfect supplier but find out that they can only handle East Coast business or one specific state or just a certain region. So that's very important as well. And also, you want to consider how you can expedite the process without bypassing it and still minimize your supplier risk in the event of an emergency. An example I like to use a lot, Constantine, is you've got water squirting out of the wall. You don't have time to go through the standard onboarding process. Well, does someone in your organization have the rights to submit that information on behalf of the supplier, maybe fast-track their registration? Or in the real emergency, again, the water squirting out of the wall, how do you handle non-PO invoices? Or can you handle non-PO invoices at all? Very important considerations.
So you mentioned quite a few things in the, and I like the analogy with the water squirting on the wall. We think of the Dutch boy putting his finger in the
That's a real-world example.
So what is the real-world example? So we talk about, kind of these different aspects. What would be that real-world example that you could think of that you could share with the audience here today?
Sure. I'll give you a real-world example. A company that recently met with a nationwide grocery chain. They are wanting the ability to register the same supplier across multiple business units. In other words, they may have, without giving too much info away, they may have sub-brands and so forth. They want the ability for a supplier to register at one site, but give all of their sub-brands that are internally, they're classified, or sort of siloed. In other words, this sub-brand doesn't have access to, for example, accounting information from the other brand, and so forth. But they want a supplier to be able to register at one site and have that information filter down to all of the business units. So very important, and suppliers love that, frankly, Constantine, because if I'm a supplier, if I can register at one top-level site, but actually get business within all of the brands of that company, that's really strong. Suppliers absolutely love that, and it's very useful to the company as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that. That brings us to the second point that we're talking about with core processes, and we kind of hinted at that a little bit in this past question, but around the idea of certification and compliance. And the question that we really have is are you properly managing and bringing on that information, whether you're looking for it right now or not? And so, one example that we keep coming across here at Determine is diversity. So, well, what about the diversity thing that we've come across? What do you think about that? We didn't really mention that as part of the previous example, but how would we look at this as part of this certification and compliance aspect?
No, you caught that, didn't you? Well, there's actually a reason I didn't bring that up earlier, because of the importance around supplier diversity. And some companies, as we were talking the other day, Constantine, some companies see the value of that and have a business need immediately, and other companies may not see the value of it. So let's talk a little bit about that. So depending on your business, capturing information about the ownership classification of your suppliers may be an immediate need, or it's one you should still consider to help sort of future-proof your organization. So I think it's important enough. The reason I didn't discuss it before is that we call it out as sort of its own point of our discussion here.
So why is that? I mean, there's a lot of debate around this idea of, how am I tracking supplier diversity in that example? Why is it important?
Sure. Well, it can affect your bottom line. Now, a lot of businesses, new businesses, as well as getting new business and keeping the business that you have. For example, you may have a customer that actually requires you. We'll talk more about this in just a few moments, but you may have a customer, perhaps a sizable customer of yours, that requires that you track this information because they, in turn, capture that, and they may get additional business on their end from it. They may get awards that are significant in their industry, which, again, could bring more business. It could also possibly affect your funding. From having worked with various government-funded agencies and organizations over the years that receive any amount of funding from the federal government, they are, in turn, required to track some of this. And sort of the gold standard, at least in the U.S. for this, is the Small Business Administration. They have a number of classifications. And just to give you some examples, everyone knows about minority-owned business, which, of course, if you track that, you need to, in turn, track what type of minority. Woman-owned businesses, those are the common ones. But if you look at SBA classifications, again, if you receive government funding, you really need to adhere to the precise classification that the SBA has put forth. So just to give you a quick example, some other classifications that you need to track would be veteran-owned business, disabled veteran-owned business, small business enterprise, for example, historic black college and universities. Those are just some examples. But again, I strongly recommend that companies really look to the SBA as sort of the gold standard in the U.S. for what information they need to capture from their suppliers.
You also said something, and I caught this earlier in the discussion about future-proofing your organization. What do you mean by future-proofing in this context of certification and compliance, Gene?
Sure. Yeah, I did, didn't I? So it's important to track your organization's usage of Tier 1s. And again, as you and I, we were discussing the other day, Constantine, about the need for companies that may not see that need to do that right now. So it's important to track that as future business that you don't even know about yet could be dependent on that. So a potential customer may need to, in turn, be able to report this data back to their customers. So as a Tier 1, it gets kind of confusing, but let me just sum it up. As a Tier 1 supplier to that potential customer, if you're unable to provide that downstream data, it could actually preclude you from getting that business. I actually go into it. I actually have a customer example of that. I've worked a lot with within the automotive industry with U.S. automotive companies that have a U.S. presence. And here I actually will name a few: Toyota Motor Manufacturing, Kia, Mercedes-Benz, Subaru, just to name a few. If in that industry, most of those organizations have a requirement where you have to do 10% of your business, your spend has to be with diverse suppliers. The issue is a lot of suppliers to automotive don't know how to get that 10%. That's a whole different discussion. But they have to be able to track the spend that they do have. Now, again, if you're an organization that's doing no business with automotive now, and you're not tracking that information at this point, 2 years from now, a year from now, 6 months from now, you get a potential opportunity to do business with one of those organizations. Immediately, they hit you with that 10% requirement, for example, to track your Tier 1 spend, your spend with those Tier 1s, and the diverse percentage of that. If you don't already have that on file, that actually could preclude you from getting that business. If you do have that on file, that's very, very strong, especially if you're in a competitive situation with other potential suppliers to that organization, to be able to go in and say from day one, yes, we track our diverse spend both maybe at the Tier 1 and the Tier 2 level. So that's very, very strong.
Excellent, excellent. So moving on to the third question here, all about expedited purchasing. So assuming you got the onboarding, you got the compliance and the certifications in place, you're trying to do some kind of expedited purchasing. And so the question really comes into place of how easily can you initiate this purchasing process for a new supplier? So let's discuss, the potential delays to the purchasing process. So in order to expedite the ability for purchasing to quote or buy against a supplier, how have companies traditionally handled this kind of expedited need in the past?
Sure. That's another good question. Now, as we saw in one of the earlier research slides, I believe, Jimmy did a great job because when asked to describe the process flow between procurement, AP, and payments, for example, most respondents said they had common leadership. There was support, but their functions were still separate with very little integration along those lines. So multiple manual processes are occurring, only some may be partially automated, or it's a completely linear process with only one step happening at a time. Again, to give you an example, the company may have a supplier going through the onboarding process. Only when they're done, legal now gets involved and begins the contracting step, executing maybe a non-disclosure agreement, maybe a service level or a sales agreement, or some other kind of contract. When that's complete, then and only then can purchasing finally include that supplier in the quoting and purchasing process. So very time-consuming, very inefficient. So the organization doesn't have an easy way to do this and control the process at the same time. So just based on experience, it can lead to purchasing. I'm not saying that I've been part of a purchasing department that has done this. Let's just say I know it occurs. Purchasing sometimes gets into a position where they feel they have to do what they have to do, and I understand that. So they proceed down a path of using a supplier that maybe hasn't been properly vetted, hasn't gone through the full onboarding process, may have no contracts in place, no non-disclosure, what have you. It's very, very risky. And it can be costly on several fronts, for example.
So given this kind of expedited process happens, sometimes it may not happen optimally, what are some of the best practice ways to accomplish a better way for aligning this?
Sure. Well, let's look at the ideal situation. I like the phrase well-oiled machine, because ideally you want every one of your teams working simultaneously. That's the key word, simultaneously working towards the same goal. For example, the supplier is going through the onboarding process, while at the same time, legal is initiating any additional contracts needed with the supplier, the NDAs, the SLAs, for example. And they're ready to activate the instant onboarding is complete. At the same time, again, not being held up by any of the other steps, purchasing is creating a quote or a requisition that can be immediately assigned and sent to that supplier the instant onboarding and contracting are complete. So again, instead of having a linear process with one of these steps occurring to completion before the next step can occur, all your teams are working together, both for the organization and for the supplier, to get them onboarded as quickly possible, or as quick as possible, get any contracting that's needed to keep legal happy in place and to reduce the, mitigate the risk for the company, and get purchasing happy because now they got a supplier that is ready to provide them perhaps a good or service that they didn't have easy access to, or a far more cost-effective solution, so it's ready for them to go. Just to give you a quick example on that case, I've worked with a not-for-profit organization in the Washington, D.C. area that exactly, they were going through that same situation right there. Each department, while being part of the large organization, was pretty much siloed. So contracting really didn't have much input or viewing into what purchasing was doing, who didn't have much of a view into the supplier onboarding team, which typically is a subset of the purchasing department, but they may not have had a very good view of where the supplier was in the process. So in the meantime, you've got buyers that need new suppliers to buy things, don't have the suppliers that they need to do so, and may not know that the process of onboarding those suppliers and getting them ready for them is even occurring.
Excellent, excellent. Great example there. I think the fourth one that we came up with in terms of the idea is just the notion of corporate-wide access of supplier information. So the sense is can you access approved supplier lists that exist across different business units or even different countries within the organization? I mean, let's focus on this, again, from a supplier perspective. How difficult has it traditionally been for companies to really share this vetted, qualified supplier information, even within their own organization?
In a word, typically difficult. To go back to one of our earlier slides, we saw the majority, I think it was 85%. I mean, that's strong. That tells you something right there. 85% of respondents noted poor visibility of the suppliers across the organization. They all said that was a big problem. And it's huge. I mean, it typically is. It's common for suppliers to be spread across multiple lists, isolated maybe by business unit, or worst case, a real-world example, again, to a single individual at a business unit. I've run into a lot of organizations, worked with a lot of organizations where a supplier has a single contact at the company, and it may even be a risk mitigation issue because their single contact may be an old college roommate, an old friend of the family, or what have you. So it causes a lot of issues. For one, you can't leverage your economies of scale to drive down your cost of goods, services. You can't reduce the number of active suppliers being used by an organization, and I'll come back to what I mean by active again in a moment. And you can't centralize supplier data to a master source. You're going to have duplicate supplier entries within multiple lists, spread across multiple business units. Again, you can have access databases, Excel spreadsheets, Post-it notes, no joke, Post-it notes. And even among those, you may have the same organization, the same supplier that multiple people in the company know of, but they're all using a different source for that information. And those sources may have different contacts. They may have inactive or wrong phone numbers, incorrect banking information, so it can be a real nightmare.
So, okay, so the big question then is how within this context of these issues that are, traditionally you come across, how do you even start to try to solve those problems?
Sure. Well, you ever hear the phrase that there's just some things you can't throw software against? Well, this actually isn't one of them. You can throw software against this problem. Matter of fact, it makes it much, much easier. Ideally, what you want is a single source onboarding tool and a repository because it makes it a lot easier to collect all the supplier data all in one place, make those fully vetted suppliers accessible to use across an entire organization. And it also allows you better control the suppliers that you do make available across the organization. By way of example, let's go back to the automotive industry. I had worked with a company in the automotive industry. They had 28 locations. They were over 3 countries. They had over 2,000 suppliers when I first started my relationship with them. And we actually narrowed that down to about 400 active. In other words, they had legacy supplier information from multiple sources. No one knew whether the supplier was even in business with the contact information was correct. So one of the first things we did was to get all of this information into a single repository to see what kind of duplication we had and what kind of different information that we had. So again, we were able to narrow down 2,000 suppliers from the start of the relationship down to about 400 active, again, in a common supplier repository that all locations had access to. I mean, that's very, very important.
Excellent. Finally, we had 5, so the 5th that we wanted to discuss here is really the idea of empowering users and suppliers, and the empowerment, kind of coming from the AP side, particularly in how they're trying to work with, information oftentimes where they may not have access or something may not be in place. So is supplier info or credentialing easily accessible or updated? And so, one of the examples that we were coming up with, I think when we were talking, Gene, was, AP wants to pay an invoice and they don't know the supplier and they need the bank account and where to make the payment, not to mention that, the supplier actually wants to get paid. So
Sure.
how do you empower that scenario for these different stakeholders?
Well, as we were discussing the other day, the supplier onboarding process, it should be interactive even after it's completed. It's not a one and done type process. It's not something you do up front. I know we have that supplier information and we're done with it at this point. So let's sort of discuss some of the benefits for the organization and for the supplier as well of making that process, making that an interactive experience through the life of their interaction with the organization. So the supplier should be able to easily update things like their contacts, bank account information, phone numbers, addresses, any commonly changeable information. The supplier should be able to update that whenever they need to. They should also be able to upload any revised documentation, such as diverse certifications, certificates of insurance. Let's say, again, tracking your diverse suppliers, you have a supplier that was a minority-owned business, had certification along those lines, but just now through a national organization such as the Women's Business Enterprise National Council, for example, WeBank, is now a woman-owned business as well. Well, how do they let your company know about it? It needs to be an interactive process. They need to be able to easily log back into your supplier portal, for example, and correct and update that information. Certificates of insurance, very, very important, because again, that's a huge risk, a risky situation there to have suppliers at one of your locations with a expired certificate of insurance, and any other business-related documents that they need to. So again, let's go back to one of our earlier slides. I believe it was 15%. 15% of respondents said they wanted more AP integration within the procurement process. So the supplier should be able to verify and look up payment information without calling in and requiring a member of the company's AP or accounting team to do it for them. So by way of example, conversely, many organizations, supplier-facing team members typically don't have access to the accounting system in order to look that up, at least payment data anyway. And they do, however, have access to a procurement system with integrated payment data. So just to give you an idea, how many times, for the folks on the phone, have you gotten a call from a supplier that a lot of times, again, I know this happens because it happened to me all the time, the day after they provide a good or service well under your terms, you may have net 30, net 60, you're way underneath that, they're already calling looking for payment. I don't blame them. I never blame them. I mean, I would be asking for that too. But they're calling folks either in your accounting team, maybe in your AP department. They may be calling a local business unit that has, again, you may have centralized AP functions back at a headquarters, but your business unit has no idea. So the ideal is to give them access to a system, again, that they do have access to, like a procurement system, where your team members can look that up for the supplier. The absolute ideal for that, Constantine, would be to educate and empower. There's that empower word again. Empower your suppliers to do so themselves going forward. So I would always coach my team to say, when a supplier called with that, I'd be happy to look that up for you. Oh, while I'm doing so, by the way, did you know with your access to our vendor portal, you can look this up yourself whenever you'd like. Suppliers love that. They absolutely love that, Constantine.
Thanks. That's great. So this kind of rounds out the top 5, some of these processes that we talked about, the P2P's view of supplier management. So based on the discussion that we just had on these 5 processes, these are just some of the core fundamentals of understanding how sharing of data, supplier information, P2P, really needs to come together in some kind of automated format. So one aspect of looking at how that really needs to happen is the context of metadata. understanding how dynamic data between suppliers, sourcing, contracts, and procurement can come together, how that information can be shared across a platform so different stakeholders and different users can have access to that data, but also in a way to be able to complete the data cycle management and make sure that that data is valid and consistent and updated, preventing any kind of misunderstandings or misuse of that information, whether you're dealing with the supplier directly or dealing with other stakeholders. Another aspect of this is the master data component. How does this system and process that you have in place allow you to easily configure information and data and easily render that into one system? Understanding how that is also important is that the consistency across that platform ensures that everybody's looking at the same type of information of whether you're dealing with a certificate of insurance or you're trying to ensure that you have the right bank account or dealing with the payment that is being made to a supplier. You also have the conception of no complex interfaces to manage across systems, so that if you're trying to bring data from multiple systems and bring that into a one single source of view for managing all your suppliers and how you're managing P2P, that becomes important. And especially from an efficiency standpoint, as I mentioned before, efficiency for all stakeholders, both internal and external, to making sure that process is there. And then finally, the process itself. Business processes that are defined across the entire suite and managed from start to finish. So dealing with things like onboarding could be a multi-step process that doesn't just happen just because a supplier is onboarded, but also might continue through later stages where things like diversity might become important, or other aspects of different information need to be brought into the process, or even during points of expiration that are multitasked and multi-workflowed as part of a process. Finally, the dynamic processes that are also self-adaptive in real time, of knowing when I might need to add a supplier or onboard a supplier, or what prevents me from onboarding that supplier in order for me to go to that next step. And then finally, the compliance and total visibility that we have. So as part of this is the big picture and what we understand. We can see that bringing together the data and looking at some images of what we do here at Determine, bringing together the data enables visibility. So if I go back to the scenario that Gene and I just talked about, suppliers, the first example is how do I know what my onboarding process is, what the workflow. How do I then, in my second scenario, we talked about certification and compliance, bringing together the onboarding, the certification and compliance, and being able to see that in one fell swoop, and then being able to understand the context of contracts, the relationships I have, how do I work with that supplier, knowing the certification, the compliance, and that the onboarding has already happened. And then finally, dealing with the purchasing and knowing that I want to buy from that supplier, what visibility do I have in what I've already bought from that supplier, or what I'm planning on buying, with what catalogs I have in place, and how that ties in with that rest of that onboarding, certification, or even contracts that I have. And then finally, the scenario of even having to have payment and validation, and knowing what kind of bank account information I might have, or other types of information that accounts payable might require, or suppliers might need to have, or realize that might be missing in order to complete the cycle. So as we kind of complete this thought here, Gene, I don't know if you have any thoughts on what we could say for the bigger process here of what automation needs to happen in order for these 5 steps or these 5 core scenarios to happen.
Well, I think the key is, Constantine, as you're pointing out, you really need to have a unified platform, an integrated platform that brings all of this as the only way to empower your users and empower your suppliers, and recognize all the benefits, again, that you would get from such a platform. Bringing that type of technology in-house is very powerful. I mean, it really is, and it allows you to, from a purchasing and a procurement standpoint, really automate the control, automate a lot of the functions that were in-house. And quite frankly, a lot of times regarding purchasing and procurement SOPs, really bring a lot of functions, control, and capabilities that your organization, that an organization may have never even considered before. So from experience, I typically find that when I meet with an organization about some of these things, we're just bringing ideas to them that are very strong, they're best practices that they may never have considered or had a way to do before. So it really allows them to expand their SOPs quite dramatically.
Thanks, Gene.
All right, Constantine, Gene, thank you both so much. Very interesting content there. So it's time for our next poll question. We want to know, what processes have you and your organization automated? Options are supplier onboarding, supplier information management, supplier risk and performance, contract management, e-procurement, and e-invoicing. Give you a couple seconds to answer as many of those as you have automated. All right, thank you guys for answering our poll questions. It greatly helps our research practice once again. So for the final section here, we wanted to give you some supplier management best practices before we go into Q&A today. This will be a very quick section, just a couple high-level best practices. First one is to educate your suppliers on the benefits of portal and information management solutions. Explain to them this is going to result in quicker inquiry times, quicker payment, and ease of access to forms and other data that they may need. Also communicate the non-monetary metrics too, like a reduction in fraud and other negative benefits. It's also important to educate internal stakeholders. They will be the driving force behind the implementation and adoption of your solution, right? So tell them about the low or no fees and intuitive interface, value-added services for suppliers, and the solution providers that have removed many long-standing barriers to the participation of suppliers. And once you've made the leap to bring a solution into your process, onboard strategically. Evaluate suppliers to gauge whether or not they're technically mature and willing to onboard onto your solution. Identify the best way to conduct outreach. Usually it's a multi-pronged approach, whether that's email, phone, or snail mail. Work with the solution provider to structure that onboarding campaign to maximize participation. And choose a provider who understands how to segment suppliers strategically. Finally, the final supplier management best practice is to always be assertive whenever possible. Even if you don't have the bargaining power because you're a smaller buyer amongst very large suppliers, enforce deadlines whenever possible and set up a plan to phase out unwilling and unresponsive suppliers over time. And of course, be sure to communicate that your plans to do this and to tell them the reason why, that they're not onboarding to a technology and solution that's ultimately going to be beneficial to them. So, maybe if enough of their buyers are doing the same thing, they'll change their tune a little bit. All right, well, that is the end of our scheduled program today. It's time to get to some of the questions you guys have submitted. Looks like our first question is from Frank. Frank wants to know, you had talked about empowering users and suppliers. Can you talk about how you do that in the procurement process itself? You want to take that one?
Yeah, sure, Jimmy. This is Gene. Great question. We talked about an integrated platform, and again, as Frank had mentioned, how we discussed that should foster empowering user and supplier alike. But in the procurement process, let me give you some specific examples from purchasing and procurement side. An integrated dispute process as part of the receiving step, for example, as part of the contracting step, allowing the supplier to initiate a termination if that was available for that contract, to re-up an existing contract. All very strong. Again, if you allow your suppliers to register and have a vendor portal where they can respond to these, in other words, one of your users gets the wrong thing, gets a broken item, and they can initiate the dispute process within your procurement software, and the supplier respond to that, keeps it all single platform, full transparency. That's great. Another one would be the order receipt process, where the supplier can acknowledge the receipt of the order. You have a system that can capture that, very strong. And it allows you to place the onus back on the supplier, who obviously, they've got a vested interest in your business, of course. So it allows them, you could allow them to update their own catalog items within your procurement system, which in turn, that system should be dynamic enough to control the process. For example, the supplier updates their catalog items based on the year-end typical negotiated pricing that we all go through in procurement. And then those items, in turn, go to a member of your purchasing team to review before they're made live and your users can order against them. And also the ability, another good thing, an empowerment side from procurement from that standpoint, is giving your suppliers the ability to flip a PO. I would imagine most of the folks on the call know that, but by way of example, to allow your suppliers to log in and upload an invoice and match the PO. Again, the onus is back on the supplier. They have control, but they're doing the work for your folks, for some of your AP team and so forth. So all those are very strong examples, Jimmy.
Excellent. Thanks for the question, Frank. Next question is from Pete. Pete wants to know, based on your experience, are there any gotchas you can point to in the supplier registration and onboarding process?
Sure, Jimmy. How long do you have? I'll give you a good one. Good practice is always to refer to the supplier as a potential supplier of goods and services to your organization. Some suppliers, again, through experience, I've learned this the hard way, they're under the impression that because they've registered with your organization and they're live, they've got the email to confirm it, that your organization is automatically going to be giving them new business. Registration is simply a seat at the table, if you will. So when and whether a matching bid opportunity becomes available, that's unknown. You don't know that. The supplier doesn't know that. Also, the supplier still needs to earn the business through a fair bidding process. So again, during the entire registration process, I always say, you know, this is our process that you need to do to become a potential supplier of goods and services to our company.
Yeah, in addition, I would add to that on the buying side, just making sure that you have the complete linkages to understanding where the supplier might flow. So sometimes when you want to register the supplier, you might have some generic information that you're asking, but there might be specific linkages and specific pieces that you want to have in addition to the core registration that you have with supplier. So if you're looking at a solution to understand, you know, how dynamic that process is, you really need to look at that and saying, you know, is this process a generic onboarding process to register, but can that link back to specific things that I'm looking for, like the things that Gene and I talked about, whether it was diversity or W8, W9s, or other types of certifications that you might want to have linked to before that supplier can be fully onboarded.
All right, thanks guys for your questions, and thanks to the Determined team for your answers. Remember that if you're viewing this on demand, you can still put a question into the Q&A box on your screen, and it'll get emailed to Constantine, Gene, and myself, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. I'd like to thank Constantine and Gene for joining us today. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Yep, thank you, Jimmy, and thanks everyone in the audience today. It was our pleasure.
Yeah, thanks everyone, and this will be available for download shortly after the live broadcast if you want to download and share it with some of your coworkers.
Thanks, Jimmy, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. I hope you found it helpful.